November 14, 1965. A clearing in the dense jungle of the Central Highlands of Vietnam. The place has no name that Americans can pronounce, just map coordinates. Landing zone X-ray. Within hours, this patch of elephant grass surrounded by jungle will become the site of the first major battle between the United States Army and the North Vietnamese Army. Before the sun sets 3 days later, hundreds of men will be dead. The survivors will have fought one of the most intense, brutal, close-quarters battles in American military history. This is not a story about bombing campaigns or strategic failures. This is a story about men on the ground, face to face with the enemy, fighting for their lives and for each other. This is the Battle of Ia Drang, and it will set the pattern for the entire Vietnam War. Everything that happens here, the courage and the terror, the confusion and the carnage, the helicopters and the firepower, the determination of the enemy and the resilience of American soldiers, all of it will be repeated in hundreds of battles over the next decade. But this is the first. This is where America learns what kind of war Vietnam will be. The movie was called We Were Soldiers, released in 2002, starring Mel Gibson as Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore. The film was based on the book We Were Soldiers Once and Young, written by Moore himself and journalist Joseph Galloway, who was there as a combat photographer. The movie captured something essential about Ia Drang. It showed the humanity of the soldiers on both sides. It showed the wives waiting at home, receiving telegrams about their husbands' deaths. It showed the chaos of combat, the fear, the bonds between men. But no movie, no matter how well made, can fully capture what happened in that valley. The reality was even more intense, more confusing, more terrible than anything Hollywood could portray. To understand Ia Drang, you need to understand where America was in November 1965. U.S. combat troops had been in Vietnam for only 8 months. The first Marines landed at Da Nang in March. Since then, the buildup has been rapid. By November, there are nearly 200,000 American troops in country. Most are still learning the terrain, the climate, the enemy. The strategy is still being developed. General William Westmoreland, commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam, believes in a war of attrition. Find the enemy, fix them in place, destroy them with superior firepower. The idea is that America can inflict casualties faster than North Vietnam can replace them, that eventually the communists will run out of men and will to fight. This strategy will ultimately fail, but in November 1965, it still seems viable. The 1st Cavalry Division, Airmobile, is the newest and most innovative unit in the U.S. Army. It is built around the helicopter. Instead of walking into battle or riding in trucks, the cavalry troopers will fly. Helicopters will carry them to battle, supply them, evacuate their wounded, provide fire support. The theory is that air mobility will give American forces unprecedented speed and flexibility. They can strike anywhere, concentrate forces rapidly, exploit opportunities. The 1st Cav arrived in Vietnam in September 1965. By November, they are ready for their first major test. The area around the Ia Drang Valley in the Central Highlands has been identified as a major infiltration route for North Vietnamese forces coming down from Cambodia. Intelligence reports indicate significant enemy presence. North Vietnamese Army regulars, not just Viet Cong guerrillas, are in the area in regimental strength. The mission of the 1st Cavalry Division is to find them and destroy them. This is exactly the kind of search and destroy operation that will characterize the American way of war in Vietnam. Go into enemy territory, find the bad guys, kill them, then move on to the next operation. The 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment, is commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Harold G. Moore, a West Point graduate and experienced officer. Moore is 43 years old, a family man, deeply religious, and completely professional. He is exactly the kind of officer the Army wants leading men in combat. Moore has trained his battalion intensively since arriving in Vietnam. He has studied the tactics of both the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese. He knows this will not be like Korea or World War II. This enemy is mobile, tough, well-trained, and highly motivated. Moore drills his men constantly. He emphasizes marksmanship, small unit tactics, physical fitness. He also emphasizes something less tangible but equally important. He tells his men that he will be the first one off the helicopter and the last one to leave. He will never leave a man behind, alive or dead. These promises will be tested in ways Moore cannot imagine. The plan for November 14 is straightforward on paper. Moore's battalion will be lifted by helicopter into landing zone X-ray, an oval-shaped clearing about the size of a football field. X-ray is at the base of the Chu Pong Massif, a mountain that rises along the Cambodian border. Intelligence suggests enemy forces are in the area, but the exact strength and location are unknown. Moore will land with his lead elements, secure the landing zone, and then patrol outward to find the enemy. It is a reconnaissance in force, a way to draw out the enemy and bring American firepower to bear. What Moore does not know is that he is landing virtually on top of a major North Vietnamese base area. 3 NVA regiments, the 33rd, 66th, and 320th, are in the Chu Pong area. These are not guerrillas. These are regular Army soldiers, well-equipped, well-trained, experienced. Many are veterans of the war against the French. They have modern weapons supplied by China and the Soviet Union. AK-47 assault rifles, RPG rocket launchers, heavy machine guns, mortars. They know the terrain intimately, and they outnumber Moore's battalion by at least 3-1, probably more. The North Vietnamese commanders have been watching the American helicopters. They know the Americans are coming. They are ready. The helicopter assault begins at mid-morning on November 14. The first wave carries Moore and elements of B Company. The A-1 Huey helicopters, the iconic aircraft of the Vietnam War, sweep in low over the trees. Each Huey carries about 8 combat-loaded soldiers. The door gunners scan for threats, M60 machine guns ready. The landing zone looks quiet. Elephant grass waves in the rotor wash. The tree line is perhaps 300 yards away on all sides. The helicopters flare, hover, and touch down. The soldiers leap out and spread out to secure the perimeter. The Hueys lift off immediately to fetch the next load. So far, everything is going according to plan. Moore sets up his command post in the center of the landing zone. His radio operators cluster around him. Communications are vital in this kind of operation. Moore needs to talk to his companies, to the helicopters, to his artillery support, to his higher headquarters. He also has with him a young United Press International photographer named Joseph Galloway. Galloway will spend the next 3 days photographing the battle and helping to carry wounded soldiers. Years later, he and Moore will write their book together. But right now, Galloway is just trying to survive and do his job. The landing continues throughout the morning. More companies arrive. B Company, then a company, then parts of C Company. Each lift takes time. The Hueys have to fly back to the pickup zone, load more troops, fly back to X-ray. It takes hours to get the entire battalion on the ground. This is a vulnerability. For those hours, Moore has only part of his force. If the enemy attacks during the landing, it could be catastrophic. But the NVA commanders are patient. They wait. By early afternoon, Moore has most of his battalion on the ground, about 450 men. He sends patrols out from the landing zone to reconnoiter. B Company moves toward the mountain. A company patrols to the north. C Company secures the southern sector. It is the B Company patrol that makes first contact. One platoon, led by Lieutenant Henry Herrick, spots what they think is a small group of enemy soldiers and gives chase. It is a trap. The NVA have been using small groups to lure American units into ambushes. Herrick's platoon pursues the enemy soldiers into the trees. Suddenly, the jungle erupts with gunfire. Heavy automatic weapons fire rips through the platoon. Men go down screaming. The rest dive for cover. Within seconds, the platoon is pinned down, surrounded by NVA soldiers firing from spider holes and fighting positions. Herrick tries to pull his men back, but the NVA fire is too intense. Several soldiers are killed in the first seconds, including Herrick himself. The platoon sergeant takes command. The survivors cluster in a small perimeter, maybe 30 yards across. They are perhaps 200 yards from the main American position, but they might as well be on the moon. Between them and safety are hundreds of North Vietnamese soldiers. The platoon, now cut off, will be known as the Lost Platoon for the next 24 hours. Moore now faces his first major decision. He has a platoon in contact, surrounded, taking casualties. He needs to reinforce them or extract them, but he also knows that sending more men into that jungle could result in more units being surrounded. The NVA are clearly present in strength. The battle Moore expected to fight in coming days is happening right now. He makes the decision that will define the battle. He will hold the landing zone, reinforce his perimeter, and use firepower, artillery, and air support to destroy the enemy. He will not abandon Herrick's platoon, but he will not send men blindly into the jungle either. He will fight from a strong position. The North Vietnamese commander has made his decision too. He will attack the landing zone with everything he has. He will overrun the American position before reinforcements can arrive, before American firepower can be fully brought to bear. The NVA soldiers begin moving through the jungle toward X-ray from multiple directions. They are good soldiers. They move quietly, using cover, coordinating their assault. They have orders to get close to the Americans before opening fire, to, as they say, grab the Americans by the belt, getting so close that American artillery and air strikes cannot be used without hitting their own men. The battle begins in earnest in mid-afternoon. NVA soldiers emerge from the trees and attack the American positions. The firing is intense, almost continuous. The sound is overwhelming, a wall of noise that makes communication difficult. M16 rifles, M60 machine guns, grenades, all firing at once. The NVA come in waves. They are brave, almost recklessly so. They charge across open ground into American fire. Many are cut down, but others keep coming. They get close enough to throw grenades. Some reach the American foxholes, and there is hand-to-hand combat. The American soldiers are terrified, but they hold. Moore moves around the perimeter, encouraging his men, directing fire, calling for artillery support. The artillery begins to land, 105 shells falling in the jungle just beyond the perimeter. The explosions are deafening, trees are shattered, the air fills with smoke and dust. But still, the NVA keep attacking. They seem to have unlimited numbers. Kill one and two more appear. The fighting continues as afternoon turns to evening. The casualties mount on both sides. The battalion aid station in the center of the landing zone fills with wounded. The medics work frantically, triaging, bandaging, starting IVs, calling for medevac helicopters. The medevac Hueys brave enemy fire to land and pick up the wounded. Some helicopters are hit and crash. Others make it out with their precious cargo of bleeding soldiers. As darkness falls, Moore knows his situation is desperate. He has lost about 15% of his force killed or wounded. Herrick's lost platoon is still surrounded. The enemy is all around the perimeter, and he knows the NVA often attack at night. He calls for reinforcements. Another battalion, the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, is ordered to march overland to X-Ray. They will arrive the next morning. Until then, Moore and his men are on their own. The night is terrifying. The darkness is absolute under the jungle canopy. The soldiers can hear the NVA moving in the jungle, talking, preparing for another assault. Flares hang in the sky, dropped by Air Force C-47s, casting eerie shadows. The soldiers stay in their foxholes, weapons ready, trying not to fall asleep, trying to see threats in the darkness. Every sound might be the enemy. Several times during the night, the NVA probe the perimeter, testing for weak points. Each time they are driven back by American fire and artillery. Moore does not sleep. He spends the night moving along his lines, checking positions, talking to his company commanders on the radio, calling in artillery strikes on suspected enemy assembly areas. He is everywhere, a calm presence in the chaos. His soldiers draw strength from his confidence. If the old man is not panicking, then maybe they will be okay. This is leadership at its most elemental, not grand strategy, but personal courage and presence. Dawn on November 15 brings no relief. As light creeps over the landing zone, the NVA attack again. This time the assault is even larger. Hundreds of soldiers charge the perimeter from multiple directions simultaneously. The NVA commanders have decided to overwhelm the Americans with mass. The fighting is desperate. In some places, the NVA reach the American foxholes. Soldiers fight with rifles, pistols, knives, entrenching tools, anything they can use. The noise is indescribable. Thousands of weapons firing at once. Grenades exploding, artillery shells crashing into the jungle, the screams of wounded and dying men. At one critical point, the NVA break through the southern perimeter. A gap opens in the American line. NVA soldiers pour through, heading for the command post and aid station in the center. If they reach it, the battle is lost. Moore sees what is happening. He grabs every man he can find, cooks, radio operators, anyone who can hold a rifle, and leads a counterattack. They charge into the NVA penetration. The fighting is at point-blank range. Men shoot each other from feet away. Grenades are thrown back and forth. Slowly, desperately, the Americans push the NVA back. The line holds. It is the closest the battle comes to disaster. By mid-morning, the NVA assault peters out. They have suffered enormous casualties. The jungle around X-Ray is littered with their dead. American estimates will later put NVA losses at over 600 killed just on the first day and night. The Americans have lost 79 killed and 121 wounded. The lost platoon is still surrounded, still holding on. Throughout the day, American artillery and airstrikes have tried to help them without hitting them. It is almost impossible. The jungle is so thick that pilots cannot see the ground, but the platoon has survived through the night by sheer determination. During the morning of November 15, reinforcements begin to arrive. The 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry marches into X-Ray, then B Company, 2nd Battalion, 5th Cavalry is lifted in by helicopter. Moore now has nearly a battalion and a half on the ground, close to 1,000 men. He uses the reinforcements to expand his perimeter and to finally rescue the lost platoon. A company fights its way through the jungle to the surrounded men. When they link up, they find 8 survivors out of the original 27. The rest are dead or so badly wounded they cannot move. The bodies of the dead are scattered around the small perimeter. The survivors have been fighting continuously for 24 hours. They are out of water, low on ammunition, and exhausted beyond comprehension. But they held. The rest of November 15 and into November 16 sees continued fighting, but the intensity begins to decrease. The NVA are pulling back, regrouping. They have taken severe losses, but they are not defeated. Moore's battalion has also taken severe losses. Every company is under strength. Ammunition has been expended at a prodigious rate. Water and medical supplies are running low despite constant helicopter resupply. The soldiers are exhausted. Many have not slept in 48 hours. The stress of continuous combat is showing. Some men have the 1,000-yard stare, eyes that see but do not focus. They continue to function, but part of them is already gone. On November 16, Moore is ordered to prepare to move out. Another battalion will relieve his position. His men will march to landing zone Albany, about 6 miles away, where helicopters will pick them up and return them to base. Moore is reluctant. His men are exhausted. The march will take them through unsecured jungle, but orders are orders. On the morning of November 17, Moore's battalion moves out, marching in column through the jungle. With them is the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry. About 400 men from each battalion, strung out in a long line, moving slowly through dense vegetation. What happens next is arguably worse than anything that happened at X-Ray. The march to Albany becomes a nightmare. The NVA have not given up. They shadow the American column. Around noon, as the lead elements reach landing zone Albany, the NVA attack. They hit the column from both sides simultaneously. The American formation is stretched out over hundreds of yards. Companies are separated. Platoons are intermixed. When the NVA attack, the column disintegrates. Soldiers dive for cover. Firefights erupt up and down the line. But this is not like X-Ray, where the Americans had a perimeter and artillery support. This is chaos. Units are mixed together. No one knows where anyone else is. The jungle is so thick that soldiers cannot see more than a few yards. The NVA are everywhere, moving through the column, shooting Americans at close range. The battle at Albany lasts for hours. It is every man for himself. Small groups of soldiers cluster together and fight. Some groups are overrun, others hold out. The NVA do not mass and charge like they did at X-Ray. Instead, they infiltrate, using the jungle for cover, shooting and moving, picking off isolated soldiers. It is a turkey shoot. The Americans call desperately for artillery, but it is hard to bring in because friendly forces are scattered everywhere. Some artillery lands on American positions by mistake, adding to the casualties. By late afternoon, the NVA begin to withdraw. They have inflicted horrific losses. Of the roughly 400 men in the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, 155 are killed and 124 wounded. Some companies are nearly wiped out. The survivors are traumatized. Many are wounded. They spend the night in small perimeters, terrified that the NVA will come back. Relief forces arrive the next day and find a scene of carnage. Bodies are everywhere, scattered through the jungle. The wounded are in terrible condition, having lain in the jungle all night. Recovering the dead takes days. Some bodies are not found for weeks. Moore's battalion, the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, was at the head of the column and escaped the worst of the ambush at Albany, but they lost additional men. Overall, the Battle of Ia Drang, counting both X-Ray and Albany, cost the Americans 234 dead and more than 250 wounded. For 1 week of fighting, these are staggering casualties. Entire platoons have been wiped out. Some companies have lost half their men. The survivors are marked by the experience. Many will have nightmares for the rest of their lives. The North Vietnamese also suffered terribly. American estimates put NVA losses at over 1,000 killed, possibly as many as 1,800. The NVA regiments that fought at Ia Drang were badly mauled. They withdrew back into Cambodia to refit and receive replacements, but they had learned valuable lessons. They learned that American firepower was devastating. They learned not to mass in the open where artillery and air strikes could destroy them. They learned to grab the Americans by the belt, to get so close that American fire support could not be used. And most importantly, they learned that they could stand and fight against the Americans and survive. They could inflict casualties. They could win tactical victories. The battle confirmed for the North Vietnamese that the war was winnable if they were willing to pay the price in blood. For the Americans, Ia Drang sent mixed messages. On one hand, at landing zone X-Ray, Moore's battalion had held against overwhelming odds. They had killed far more enemy than they lost. The Airmobile concept seemed vindicated. Helicopters had moved troops rapidly, supplied them under fire, evacuated casualties. Artillery and air support had been decisive. This looked like the kind of war America could win. Kill the enemy in large numbers. Use technology and firepower to offset their numerical advantage. General Westmoreland saw Ia Drang as confirmation that his strategy was correct. But landing zone Albany told a different story. It showed that the jungle could neutralize American advantages, that confusion and dispersion could negate firepower, that the NVA could choose when and where to fight, that even with helicopters and artillery, American soldiers could be ambushed and slaughtered. The lessons of Albany were largely ignored in the immediate aftermath. The focus was on X-Ray, on the successful defensive battle, on the body count showing heavy enemy losses. The body count became an obsession. Success in Vietnam would be measured by how many enemy were killed. Every battle, every operation would be evaluated by the ratio of enemy killed to friendly killed. Ia Drang looked good by this metric. The Americans killed far more than they lost, but body counts are a flawed measure of success in a war of insurgency and attrition. North Vietnam could replace losses. They had a much larger population to draw on than the Viet Cong alone. China was training North Vietnamese soldiers. The Soviet Union was providing weapons. As long as North Vietnam was willing to accept casualties, the body count strategy could not work. But this reality would take years to become apparent. The human stories from Ia Drang are what give the battle its emotional power. Consider Lieutenant Jack Geog Hagen of B Company. He was a platoon leader, 24 years old, married with a baby daughter. He fought through the first day and night at X-Ray. On the morning of November 15, during the mass NVA assault, he was hit. He kept fighting, directing his men even as he bled. He was hit again, still he fought. Finally, a third wound killed him. His body was recovered later, still at his position, still holding his weapon. He died doing exactly what Moore said officers should do, leading from the front, taking care of his men. Geog Hagen's widow received the telegram notification while watching her baby daughter. One moment she was a wife and mother with a future. The next moment she was a widow at 23 with a child who would never know her father. Consider Sergeant Major Basil Plumley, Moore's senior NCO. Plumley was a legend, a hard man who had fought in World War II and Korea. He had jumped into Normandy with the 82nd Airborne. At Ia Drang, he moved through the battle like a force of nature, directing fire, organizing the defense, personally shooting NVA soldiers who got too close. At one point, an NVA soldier charged him. Plumley killed him with a single shot from his pistol at close range. Plumley survived Ia Drang and remained Moore's right-hand man. He represented the old army, the generation that had fought and won World War II, now trying to win another war in impossible conditions. Consider the helicopter pilots and crews. They flew into landing zone X-ray again and again under heavy fire. Helicopters were hit and crashed. Pilots were killed and wounded, but they kept coming. Without them, Moore's battalion would have been wiped out. The medevac pilots, in particular, showed extraordinary courage. Their helicopters were marked with red crosses, but the NVA often fired on them anyway. The pilots would hover over the landing zone, while door gunners and medics pulled wounded soldiers aboard, all while bullets tore through the thin aluminium skin of the aircraft. Some pilots made a dozen trips in a single day. They knew each trip might be their last. They flew anyway. Consider Major Bruce Crandall, a helicopter battalion commander who flew his Huey into X-ray 22 times on November 14 alone, delivering troops and supplies, evacuating wounded. He flew so many missions that his aircraft ran low on fuel. He flew anyway, operating on fumes, determined to get every wounded soldier out. For his actions at Ia Drang, Crandall was eventually awarded the Medal of Honor, though not until 2007, more than 40 years later. The delay in recognition is typical. Many acts of courage at Ia Drang were not recognized for years, if at all. Consider Joseph Galloway, the UPI photographer. He was a civilian, a journalist. He could have stayed in the rear. Instead, he flew into X-ray on the second wave of helicopters. He spent 3 days in the battle, photographing the fighting, but also helping. He carried wounded soldiers to the aid station. He distributed ammunition. He picked up a rifle and fired at NVA soldiers attacking the perimeter. He became, in essence, an infantryman. Years later, the Army awarded him a Bronze Star with V device for valor, one of the few times a civilian has received such a decoration. His photographs and his later book with Moore brought Ia Drang to the public consciousness. The aftermath of Ia Drang was complex. The immediate reaction was celebration. The 1st Cavalry Division had met the NVA in battle and won. The body count favored the Americans heavily. The Airmobile concept worked. President Johnson and Secretary of Defense McNamara were pleased. The press coverage was generally positive. Here was proof that American soldiers could fight and win in Vietnam. But the soldiers who fought at Ia Drang knew better. They knew how close they came to disaster. They knew that luck played a role as much as skill or courage. They knew that the NVA were tough, determined, and capable. They knew that this kind of fighting, this level of intensity, could not be sustained indefinitely. Some men came out of Ia Drang questioning whether the war could be won. Others came out more determined than ever to defeat the enemy. But all were changed by the experience. Moore himself struggled with the losses. He had promised to bring every man home. He could not keep that promise. 79 of his men died at X-ray. He attended memorial services. He wrote letters to families. He questioned his decisions. Could he have done something differently? Could he have saved more men? These are the burdens of command, the weight that leaders carry. Moore eventually concluded that he did the best he could under the circumstances. He had saved hundreds of lives through his leadership, but the memory of those who died never left him. The tactical lessons of Ia Drang were studied extensively. The Army concluded that airmobile operations were viable. The helicopter was validated as a tool for moving troops and supplies. Artillery support proved crucial. American soldiers could fight and win if properly led and supported. But there were also troubling lessons. The NVA were willing to accept enormous casualties to achieve their objectives. They were skilled at ambush and infiltration. They knew the terrain and used it to their advantage. They could reinforce battles quickly from sanctuaries in Cambodia and Laos, and they had no intention of giving up. The strategic lessons of Ia Drang were largely missed or ignored. The battle seemed to confirm that American strategy was working. Find the enemy, fix them, destroy them with firepower. The problem was that this strategy required the enemy to cooperate, to stand and fight in circumstances favorable to American firepower. At X-Ray, the NVA chose to attack a strong American position and were slaughtered, but they learned from this mistake. In future battles, they would be more selective, more careful. They would attack when circumstances favored them, as at Albany, and avoid battle when they did not. The strategic initiative remained with the Communists. They chose when and where to fight. The Americans could react but not dictate. The impact on American public opinion was initially positive. Ia Drang was portrayed as a victory, proof that the war could be won. But the casualty numbers were shocking. More than 300 Americans killed in 1 week. If this was victory, what would defeat look like? As the telegrams arrived at homes across America, as the funerals were held, as the folded flags were presented to widows and parents, doubts began to grow. Could America sustain these losses month after month, year after year? Was Vietnam worth this price? The movie We Were Soldiers tried to capture the reality of Ia Drang and largely succeeded. Mel Gibson portrayed Hal Moore as a thoughtful, deeply moral commander who genuinely cared about his men. The battle scenes were intense and realistic, showing the chaos and terror of combat. The film also showed the home front, the wives waiting, the telegrams being delivered, the grief of families. This was innovative for a war movie. It showed that battles have consequences that extend far beyond the battlefield. But even a good movie cannot fully convey what those 3 days were like. The exhaustion of fighting continuously for 72 hours, the fear of knowing you are outnumbered and surrounded, the noise so loud that your ears ring for days afterward, the smell of gunpowder and blood and death, the weight of carrying a wounded friend to safety, the feeling of helplessness as a friend dies despite everything you do to save him. These things can be suggested by film, but not truly shown. The Battle of Ia Drang set patterns that would repeat throughout the war. The courage of American soldiers would never be in question. They would fight with skill and determination in the worst conditions. The leadership of junior officers and NCOs would be crucial. The support of helicopter pilots, artillery crews, and Air Force pilots would be essential. American firepower would be devastating when it could be brought to bear. But none of this would be enough to win the war. A fundamental problem, visible at Ia Drang, was that this was not a war that could be won by winning battles. North Vietnam was not going to surrender because they lost battles. They were playing a different game. They were willing to absorb casualties that would be unacceptable to Americans. They were willing to fight for decades if necessary. They had sanctuaries where they could rest, refit, and reinforce. They had a cause they believed in, the reunification of their country and expulsion of foreign forces. America had superior technology and firepower, but North Vietnam had time and will. The men who fought at Ia Drang deserved to be remembered not just as statistics or as part of a failed strategy, but as individuals who did their duty under terrible circumstances. They were young men, many barely out of high school. They were scared, but they fought anyway. They watched friends die, but continued to advance. They were wounded, but stayed on the line. They followed orders even when the orders seemed suicidal. This is courage in its purest form. Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore went on to become a general and retired as a lieutenant general. He never forgot Ia Drang. He attended reunions with his veterans. He worked to ensure that all of his men, alive and dead, were remembered. He co-authored the book that became We Were Soldiers. He testified before Congress about the war. He became a symbol of leadership and integrity. When he died in 2017, thousands attended his funeral, including men who had fought under him at Ia Drang more than 50 years earlier. Joseph Galloway also never forgot. He became one of America's most respected war correspondents. He covered conflicts around the world, but Ia Drang remained central to his identity. He spoke frequently about the battle. He attended the reunions. He fought to ensure that the men who died there were honored. The Bronze Star he received decades after the battle was less important to him than the respect of the soldiers who fought there. They considered him one of them, and that meant everything. The North Vietnamese perspective on Ia Drang is different but equally valid. They see the battle as a victory. They held the field at the end. They inflicted heavy casualties, especially at Albany. They proved that they could stand against American military power and survive. Senior Lieutenant Colonel Nguyen Hu En, who commanded the NVA forces at Ia Drang, was promoted and went on to become a general. He later met with Moore and Galloway, comparing notes on the battle. These meetings between former enemies were remarkable. Old men who once tried to kill each other, now talking, even becoming friends in a way. The meetings showed that soldiers on both sides were humans, not monsters, men who fought for what they believed was right. The long-term impact of Ia Drang on the Vietnam War is subtle but real. It established that major battles between conventional forces would be part of the war, not just guerrilla actions. It showed that American forces could move rapidly by helicopter and fight effectively. It validated the attrition strategy, at least temporarily. The body count from Ia Drang seemed to prove that America could win a war of attrition. This led to more search and destroy operations, more attempts to find the enemy and destroy them with firepower. The strategy would fail, but that failure took years to become undeniable. Ia Drang also showed the importance of close air support and artillery. American soldiers at X-ray survived because they could call in massive firepower. Bombs, artillery shells, napalm, all falling danger close to friendly positions. This became standard practice. American units learned to rely on fire support, but this created a dependency. What happened when fire support was not available, as at Albany? What happened in dense jungle where aircraft could not see targets? What happened when the enemy grabbed you by the belt and got too close for artillery? These questions would haunt the army throughout the war. The battle also highlighted the importance of leadership. Moore's presence at X-ray was crucial. He was everywhere, calm under pressure, making good decisions, inspiring his men. His leadership probably saved his battalion, but not every battalion had a Hal Moore. As the war expanded, as more units deployed, as casualties mounted, the quality of leadership varied. Some officers were excellent, others were incompetent or cowardly. Junior officers, lieutenants and captains bore a disproportionate burden. They led small units in combat, making life and death decisions at age 23 or 24. The casualty rate among junior officers was horrendous. Many of the best were killed or wounded, creating a leadership vacuum. The psychological impact of battles like Ia Drang was severe. Combat stress, what we now call PTSD, affected many soldiers. The intensity of the fighting, the casualties, the fear, all took a toll. Some men broke under the strain during the battle. Others seemed fine during the fighting but fell apart afterward. Still others carried the trauma for decades, suffering nightmares, flashbacks, survivor's guilt, depression. The Army in 1965 did not have good systems for dealing with combat stress. Soldiers were expected to tough it out. Mental health issues were seen as weakness. This meant that many men suffered in silence, their lives permanently damaged by what they experienced in places like Landing Zone X-ray. The racial dynamics of the battle and the war more broadly deserve mention. The 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry was integrated, with white and black soldiers fighting side by side. In combat, race mattered less than competence and courage. Men relied on each other regardless of skin color, but the Army as an institution still had racial problems. Black soldiers were disproportionately assigned to combat units rather than support units. They had fewer opportunities for promotion. They faced discrimination on base, and especially when they returned home. Some black soldiers began to question why they were fighting for freedom in Vietnam when they did not have full freedom at home. These tensions would grow as the war continued and the civil rights movement progressed. The media coverage of Ia Drang was extensive but often superficial. Journalists reported the battle as an American victory based on the body count. The story was that American troops using helicopters and superior firepower had defeated a much larger enemy force. This narrative fit with what the American public wanted to believe, that their soldiers were winning, that the war was going well. The reality was more complex. Yes, the 1st Cavalry Division had performed well tactically. But strategically, nothing had changed. The NVA regiments retreated into Cambodia, licked their wounds, received replacements, and prepared to fight again. The war would go on. Some journalists did dig deeper. They reported on the high casualties. They questioned whether battles like Ia Drang could be sustained over years. They noted that the NVA seemed willing to continue fighting despite losses. But these skeptical voices were in the minority in 1965. The prevailing narrative was still that America was winning. It would take more battles, more casualties, more years of inconclusive fighting before the media and public opinion turned decisively against the war. The technological advantage that America enjoyed at Ia Drang was real but not decisive. American soldiers had M16 rifles that could fire rapidly. They had M60 machine guns, M79 grenade launchers, claymore mines, sophisticated radios. The NVA had mostly AK-47s and older weapons, but in close quarters jungle fighting, technological edge matters less. An AK-47 kills just as effectively as an M16 at 50 yards. What mattered more was training, leadership, and will to fight. The NVA had all three. The artillery support at Ia Drang was crucial and innovative. Forward observers with Moore's battalion could call for fire from batteries located miles away. The artillery would respond within minutes, shells falling with remarkable accuracy. During the battle, American artillery fired more than 33,000 rounds supporting the troops at X-ray. This was an enormous expenditure of ammunition. It represented a significant logistical challenge, keeping the artillery batteries supplied. But it worked. The artillery broke up NVA attacks, disrupted their movements, killed hundreds of enemy soldiers. Without artillery, X-ray would have been overrun. The air support was equally important. F-100 Super Sabre fighter bombers dropped bombs and napalm on NVA positions. B-52 Stratofortress bombers conducted arc-light strikes, dropping thousands of tons of bombs on suspected enemy concentrations. The psychological effect of a B-52 strike was almost as important as the physical destruction. The bombers flew so high they could not be seen or heard. The bombs just suddenly appeared, creating massive explosions that obliterated everything in the target area. Soldiers who survived an arc-light strike were often useless for combat afterward, too traumatized to function. But air support had limitations. Low clouds and bad weather could prevent strikes. Smoke from fires and explosions made it hard for pilots to see targets. The jungle canopy concealed enemy positions. There was always the risk of friendly fire, of bombs falling on American positions by mistake. This happened several times during the war, with tragic results. Despite these limitations, air power was essential. The soldiers on the ground knew that if they could hold on, if they could survive until the planes arrived, they would be okay. The logistics of supporting a battle like Ia Drang were immense. Everything had to be brought in by helicopter. Ammunition, water, food, medical supplies, replacement troops, all flown in under fire. The wounded flew out on the same helicopters. The logistics system worked remarkably well considering the circumstances, but it required an enormous support infrastructure. For every combat soldier at X-ray, there were several support troops elsewhere keeping him supplied. This ratio, often called the tooth-to-tail ratio, was much higher in Vietnam than in previous wars. The army had to feed, house, supply, and move hundreds of thousands of troops across a country with limited infrastructure. This required building roads, airfields, ports, supply depots, all while fighting a war. The medical care available to wounded soldiers at Ia Drang was excellent by the standards of the time. Medics provided first aid on the battlefield. Battalion aid stations stabilized casualties. Medevac helicopters evacuated serious cases to field hospitals within minutes. Surgical teams operated around the clock. The death rate for wounded soldiers who reached medical care was lower in Vietnam than in any previous American war. A soldier who would have died in World War II had a good chance of survival in Vietnam. This was due to rapid evacuation, better surgical techniques, antibiotics, blood transfusions, and dedicated medical personnel. But survival sometimes came at a cost. Many soldiers survived with severe injuries that left them disabled for life. Missing limbs, paralysis, traumatic brain injuries, burns. They survived, but their lives were forever changed. The weapons used by both sides at Ia Drang were modern and lethal. The M16 rifle issued to American troops was controversial. It was lighter than the previous M14. It fired a smaller round that allowed soldiers to carry more ammunition, and it could fire on full automatic. But early M16s had reliability problems. They jammed frequently, especially in the dust and humidity of Vietnam. At Ia Drang, some soldiers had M16s fail at critical moments. Men died trying to clear jammed weapons while enemy soldiers rushed their positions. The jamming problem was eventually fixed with better ammunition and chrome-lined chambers, but the early M16 earned a reputation as an unreliable weapon. The AK-47 used by the NVA was simpler and more reliable than the M16. It could be dragged through mud and still fire. It was easier to maintain, but it was also heavier and less accurate. In the jungle fighting at Ia Drang, these differences were less important than they might be in open terrain. Both rifles killed effectively at close range. Machine guns were crucial. The American M60, firing 7.62 rounds, provided suppressive fire and defensive firepower. Every platoon had at least one. The gunners, who carried the 23-pound weapon plus ammunition, were priority targets for enemy fire. Being a machine gunner was one of the most dangerous jobs in the infantry. The North Vietnamese had various machine guns, including the Soviet RPD and the older, but still effective Chinese Type 56. Machine gun duels were common, with gunners on both sides trying to suppress the other's fire. Grenades were used extensively. American M26 fragmentation grenades and NVA stick grenades flew back and forth during close combat. Grenades were particularly effective in jungle fighting, where rifles could not reach enemy soldiers behind cover, but they were also dangerous to the thrower. In close quarters, there was not always time to take cover after throwing. Some soldiers were killed by their own grenades bouncing off trees and rolling back. The RPG-2 and RPG-7 rocket launchers used by the NVA were fearsome weapons. Originally designed as anti-tank weapons, they were used against American bunkers and troop concentrations. The rockets made a distinctive whooshing sound that sent soldiers diving for cover. A hit from an RPG could kill everyone in a foxhole or bunker. The NVA learned to use RPGs effectively against helicopters, shooting at them during landing and takeoff when they were most vulnerable. The Claymore mine, an American weapon, proved highly effective at Ia Drang. The M18 Claymore was a directional anti-personnel mine that could be set up quickly and detonated by remote control. It fired 700 steel balls in a 60-degree arc, devastating anything in its path out to 50 meters. Soldiers at X-ray set up claymores around their perimeter. When NVA soldiers attacked, the claymores were detonated, cutting down enemy troops in waves. The psychological effect was as important as the physical. The sound and the sight of a claymore detonation was terrifying. The role of the Montagnard Scouts with Moore's battalion has been largely forgotten but was important. The Montagnards were indigenous people from the Central Highlands. They hated the Vietnamese, both North and South, who had oppressed them for centuries. The U.S. Special Forces had recruited many Montagnards as scouts and fighters. They knew the jungle, could track enemy movements, and were excellent soldiers. The Montagnard Scouts with Moore's battalion provided early warning of NVA positions and movements. They also fought bravely during the battle, but like many indigenous allies of the United States, they were largely abandoned after the war. When South Vietnam fell, the Montagnards faced persecution. Many died, others fled to refugee camps. Their service was forgotten by most Americans. The question of war crimes at Ia Drang is sensitive but must be addressed. There is evidence that some NVA soldiers executed wounded American prisoners during and after the battle. Bodies were found with bullet wounds to the head at close range, suggesting they were killed after being wounded. This violated the Geneva Conventions, but the North Vietnamese did not consider themselves bound by these rules. They viewed captured American soldiers as war criminals, not legitimate prisoners of war. This created a climate of terror. American soldiers knew that being wounded and left behind likely meant execution. This increased their determination to recover all casualties, alive or dead, as Moore had promised. On the American side, there is less evidence of war crimes at Ia Drang specifically, though atrocities occurred elsewhere in the war. At Ia Drang, the fighting was too intense, too chaotic for much beyond survival. Soldiers shot enemy soldiers who were trying to kill them. This is combat, not a war crime, but the general ethos of the body count strategy sometimes led to abuses. Pressure to show high enemy casualties led some units to inflate numbers or count civilian dead as enemy combatants. This did not seem to be a major problem at Ia Drang, where the body count was validated by physical evidence, by the hundreds of NVA bodies found around the battlefield. The environmental impact of the battle and the war generally was severe. The bombing, the artillery, the use of napalm and white phosphorus all damaged the landscape. Trees were shattered, craters dotted the ground. The jungle, while resilient, took years to recover. The use of defoliants like Agent Orange, though not a major factor at Ia Drang, stripped vegetation and poisoned the soil elsewhere in Vietnam. Unexploded ordnance continues to contaminate the landscape. Farmers still die when their plows hit unexploded bombs. Children still find cluster bomblets and are killed when they explode. The war's environmental legacy continues decades after the fighting stopped. The comparison between Ia Drang and Custer's last stand at Little Bighorn is inevitable and was sometimes made at the time. Both battles involved the 7th Cavalry Regiment. Both involved troops surrounded by larger enemy forces. Both occurred in remote areas, but the comparison breaks down quickly. At Little Bighorn, Custer's command was wiped out. At Ia Drang, Moore's battalion held and was eventually relieved. The lesson is partly about leadership. Custer divided his forces and attacked recklessly. Moore kept his forces concentrated and fought defensively. Custer did not have artillery support or air power. Moore did. The tools and technology of warfare had changed enormously in the 89 years between the battles. The personal stories of ordinary soldiers at Ia Drang are the heart of the battle's meaning. Consider Private First Class Jimmy Nakayama, a medic who treated wounded soldiers under fire for 3 days. He ran from one casualty to another, ignoring enemy fire, stopping bleeding, starting IVs, calling for medevac. He was finally wounded himself, but continued to work until he passed out from blood loss. He survived and received the Silver Star. Or consider Specialist Robert Ouellette, a machine gunner who held his position during multiple NVA assaults, firing until his barrel glowed red. He was wounded twice, but refused evacuation. He stayed on his gun until the battle ended. These men were not professional soldiers. They were draftees, kids from small towns and big cities who rose to the occasion when tested. The draft was central to understanding the Vietnam War and Ia Drang. Many of the soldiers at Ia Drang were draftees, men who did not volunteer but were conscripted. They did not choose this war. The government ordered them to fight and they went. Some went willingly, accepting their duty. Others went reluctantly, questioning the war but unwilling to face the consequences of refusing. Still others found ways to avoid service, using college deferments, medical exemptions, or simply failing to register. The draft created inequalities. Wealthier young men could stay in college or find ways to avoid service. Poorer young men, disproportionately minorities, ended up in combat units. This inequity contributed to social tensions and eventually to the anti-war movement. The rotation system used in Vietnam also affected combat effectiveness. Soldiers served one-year tour. When their year was up, they went home. This meant that units had constant turnover. Just as a soldier learned the skills needed to survive in combat, his tour ended and he was replaced by a new guy who had to learn the same lessons. There was no unit cohesion over the long term. Unlike World War II, where divisions stayed together for the duration, Vietnam units were constantly changing. At Ia Drang, Moore had a relatively cohesive unit because the 1st Cav had only recently arrived. But as the war continued, the rotation system meant that units never developed the kind of cohesion that improves combat effectiveness. The impact on the families of those who fought at Ia Drang was profound and lasting. Wives became widows. Children grew up without fathers. Parents buried sons. The wives of soldiers in Moore's battalion lived together in military housing at Fort Benning, Georgia, while their husbands were in Vietnam. They supported each other, waited together, prayed together. When the telegrams started arriving from Ia Drang, taxis would pull up to deliver them. The army had not yet developed a system for personal notification. A telegram would arrive saying your husband was dead. No one prepared you. No counselor helped you cope. You were suddenly alone with your grief and a lifetime of loss ahead of you. The movie We Were Soldiers showed this aspect better than most war films, depicting the wives' perspective and their suffering. The question of whether Ia Drang was a victory or a defeat depends on perspective and how you define victory. Tactically, by traditional measures, it was an American victory. The American forces held the field. They inflicted far more casualties than they took. They accomplished their mission of finding and engaging the enemy. But strategically, nothing changed. The NVA regiments withdrew, received replacements, and returned to fight again. The war continued. More Americans would die in more battles like Ia Drang. In this sense, Ia Drang was at best a Pyrrhic victory, a tactical success that contributed nothing to strategic objectives. General Westmoreland saw Ia Drang as validation of his strategy. He believed that if American forces could win battles like this, they could gradually wear down the enemy, reach a crossover point where casualties exceeded the enemy's ability to replace them. This was the logic of attrition, but it required that the enemy cooperate by fighting on American terms. The NVA learned not to do this. After Ia Drang, they generally avoided major battles unless circumstances favored them. They reverted to guerrilla tactics, to ambushes, to hit-and-run attacks. They controlled the tempo of the war. Americans could search, but the enemy determined whether they would be found. The legacy of Ia Drang lives on in the United States Army. The battle is studied at military schools as a case study in small unit leadership, in the use of air mobility, in defensive tactics. The lessons, both positive and negative, have been incorporated into doctrine, but the most important legacy is in memory. The men who fought there will never forget. They gather at reunions, fewer each year as age takes its toll. They remember their friends who did not come home. They remember the fear and the courage, the chaos and the clarity. They remember that for 3 days in November 1965, they faced death and survived, and that survival means something, though they struggle to say exactly what. In the end, the Battle of Ia Drang matters because it was a test, a crucible in which men and ideas were tried. The men, by and large, passed the test. They fought with courage and skill. The ideas, the strategy, the theory of how to win in Vietnam failed the test. But that failure would take years to become undeniable, and by then tens of thousands more Americans and hundreds of thousands more Vietnamese would be dead. Ia Drang was the beginning, the first major battle in a war that would drag on for another decade. The soldiers who fought there did everything asked of them. They deserved better than the war they were given.